Well, how did breathwork change my life? That is a great question. Uh, there are so many ways that it's changed my life that I can't just ignore the fact that I'm sitting here in front of a video with my 27-year-old daughter behind the camera, who's a facilitator of said breathwork that her mother did when she was in the womb. My answers are in different areas. One is what the breath itself did for me. And the other is, what did it do to my life? And then the third thing is how breathwork became my livelihood, which was not how I ended up in it in the first place. So when I was a child, I started piano lessons when I was 5 years old. And my mother sent me to the Royal Conservatory of Music, where these old nuns, or I don't know if they were nuns, they had horn-rimmed glasses, and they had a lot of pent-up energy. And I was this confused little alienated child that knew that there was something slightly fraudulent about my surroundings, and I did not have the capacity to learn how to belong. So I had this already from 5 years old, this tendency to avoid responsibility at all costs. And I would go to these piano lessons, and I would get things to practice, and I wouldn't practice, and then I would kind of finesse and bullshit my way. But these old biddies were just super aggressive and angry, and I had this one who used to just hit the page as hard as she could with a pencil, like almost to the point that the musical page was illegible. And eventually she would smack the back of my hands. And back in the 1960s and 70s, like, parents and children were separate. Like, we as children, we were afraid of adults, and we also were against them. So I couldn't really I don't know what happened there. So back in the 1960s and 70s, adults were the enemy, or they were to be feared. So I was basically kind of being abused by this piano teacher, but I wanted to tell my parents because I was afraid of them too, particularly my mother. And so I developed all these kind of quirks in my personality, like I was against the system before I was old enough to rebel against it, but I had a quiet rebellion, so I was a little bit passive aggressive. I was kind of a little dishonest and irresponsible. I couldn't discipline myself. I was incredibly musical and wanted to be a musician, but I was also just the opposite of rebellious. I was rigid and uptight and afraid. And I had this program that if I was going to express myself, especially with music, that probably there was going to be some violation in it, and that I probably didn't do enough preparation to show people my music. So every time I was about to do something in public, my hands would turn ice cold. And I did become a professional musician. And I was about 24 years old, and I was playing in a piano bar, a rock and roll piano bar in a bohemian artsy area of Toronto. And it was perfect fit for my rebellious, independent, outcasty kind of personality. And this piano bar called Popper's Pub was, the woman who owned it, she was a British woman, a pub owner, who wanted to save money at all costs, and it remodeled and didn't put any ventilation into the place. So people smoked all the time. It was the 1980s, and they would smoke in the piano bar where I was playing from 9 p.m. to 1 a.m. 7 days a week. And she would just paint the ceiling every 3 months. I would be so beat up at the end of it. I had sore shoulders and my hands and my arms, and I used to stomp my feet when I was playing, so my knees hurt, and I would have these terrible sore throats that I didn't associate to secondhand smoke. One day I'm walking down to Popper's Pub and I see the sign, Sutherland Chan Massage Clinic, discount for newcomers, something like that. And I decide, I'm going to try this massage thing. And I go in and I get this woman whose name is Pat Lodge. And Pat had this vibe like, not just live and let live, but like she was not judgmental. She just had a kind of a feeling like I could be who I was. So I really liked her and we became fast friends, and I would go every couple weeks and I would get massage to try to fix my beat up body. And one day she played me this tape of Osho, and he was talking about the word fuck. And, it's this Indian guy saying, oh, and you say fuck, it clears the throat. It's this meditation. It was the weirdest, funniest thing. We laughed so hard that I don't even think I got a massage that day. She started to invite me to her house to get massage, which was right around the corner from the pub. And the first time I went in there, I saw this guy who turned out to be Tom Lodge, my breath teacher. I was repulsed by him. He was this English-looking guy. He looked like a little imp with bad teeth. And he didn't talk. He just sort of smiled, and I was afraid of him. Didn't talk to him. I got married. They came to the wedding. Still didn't talk to him. And one day, Pat says to me, we're moving to California. Would you help put stuff in storage, and then I'll give you a massage? And I'm like, yeah. Poor musician on a free massage. And me and my friend Andrew helped put stuff in storage. And then when it was Andrew and I put stuff in storage, and after it was over, she said, would you like to do this breath therapy, which is what my husband does? I said, sure. Now, before I tell you about the breath, I just want to say that I had a lot of connection to Tom before I even met him. I did not know it. But first off, Tom's grandfather, Sir Oliver Lodge, credited with inventing the radio and the telegraph, and among other things, he was a physicist. He was a close relationship with Tesla, and him and Tesla invented things together, and they both had a attraction to Hindu philosophy and Swami Vivekananda, which is where the breathwork comes from. But there was an interest in sound, and this guy created the telegraph and the radio. And Tom, in the early 1960s, was the lead DJ on a radio station that was operating off the coast of Britain in 1962-63. And back then, there was only one radio station in Britain, the BBC, and they didn't play particular groups like Jimi Hendrix and The Who. And so they put this ship off the coast of Britain, 150 miles off, so they couldn't be controlled in some way. And Tom was the lead DJ. So he broke all this music that was my favorite music growing up. And he was a rebel and a renegade himself, and came out of his grandfather's tradition of, transmitting through the airwaves. In 1970, he started the first recording arts program in Canada to teach people to be recording engineers. And when I was 18 and I wanted to go to a recording studio for my first time, I opened the Yellow Pages at midnight on a Saturday and just picked a place and called. And the guy who picked up, my first music mentor, Rod Phelan, was a student of Tom in that program. And Rod was the most unusual. What they were taught was to be very unconventional, because Tom grew up with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and these groups that, pioneered recorded music. Tom left it all behind to go to India in the 70s to be with Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, his guru, who later became Osho. And they went through that whole time with Osho, well documented in the Netflix documentary Wild Wild Country. And then after it was over, they moved back to Canada, which is where I met him. He learned breath work in the Osho ashram in the 1970s. And when I laid down to breathe to do this technique that he had branded breath therapy, I was just laying down to do some breathing thing that I thought was a disappointment compared to the free massage that I was going to get. And as soon as I did the breath, like as soon as I started, not even 1 minute in, I was absolutely terrified. I did not want to do it. I begged him to stop. I wouldn't stop talking. I was trying to process. I was just trying to, all my scheming that I had done to avoid the pain of my childhood and the pains that I struggled with were up in that moment. And I was trying to get him to let me stop because I didn't want to do it. And I was probably breathing and stopping, and I'm sure I was a handful. I remember some point in the middle of the breath, like thinking that he had covered my mouth and I couldn't breathe. And I opened my eyes to see what was going on. And my own hand had curled over both of them and were pressed against my mouth, almost to the point that I couldn't breathe. Now, I did finish the breath. I was exhilarated, peaceful, excited, so happy it was over. And the next day, I had just started therapy for the first time. I was like, I don't need this therapy stuff. And I quit. I was like, here's this faster route, which in retrospect was part of my pattern, like how I could get away from the rules and the structure and the process was, even though I had had this very spiritual experience, I still was trying to escape. But I hadn't made any connection between me being hit by the teachers and what had happened with my hands. Like there was no, Tom had moved to California, so I couldn't talk to him about it. But also, I just didn't really know why the body was doing that, or I didn't have the concept in my mind that the things that we repress and the injuries we have, they exist in the body. I was just waking up to my idea that I just wanted to live in my own possibility. If anything, I just wanted to get away from the past. 9 months later, I got a letter from Tom. He was in California, saying they were doing a training in San Francisco and did I want to come? And I was like, yeah. I was still a musician and I wasn't going to become a breath practitioner. I just felt like there was something about this practice that I knew in the intervening 9 months when I went to go play music, like that, the next few days, like my playing, I was just improvising and writing songs and something had worked. And I was just like, I didn't care to know why, really. I just knew that the breath practice had opened something up that had been locked up to me, that was unavailable to me previously, which was my own creativity. And of course, if you're hit, your hands are hit when you're trying to express something, like there is a message in the brain, hardwired, like don't express yourself or you're going to get hit. So I went to California, I went to San Francisco, and I was a very naive person. And I remember being in a coffee shop the first morning. They picked me up from the airport. We were in the Richmond district of San Francisco. And the coffee place had Celestial Seasonings tea. And I was a vegetarian. And I was like, oh my God, like San Francisco is like spiritual center of the world. I want to move here because like this is where spiritual people like me should live and doing these spiritual things like breath work. My wife was 8 months pregnant at the time, and I remember calling her. I called her because my training was 5 weeks long and I wanted her to come on the time that we were going to work with the public. But I was also saying, just come, let's stay here and have the baby in San Francisco and we'll live here. Now, besides having no concept of legal consequences, because of the story I told you earlier about myself, I also had no nesting instinct as a Sagittarius, and not thinking that perhaps my wife, who was 8 months pregnant, would want to ground herself somewhere and have that baby rather than just do it out in San Francisco with only knowing 2 people in the whole city. Anyway, she did come and breathed a boatload of times and ended up having a 2-hour labor that she credits to the breath work. I went back to Toronto and a changed person, but I didn't really know how. And I started to share the breathwork with whoever wanted to do it. And slowly, without realizing it, my relationship with music and music business started to turn toward breathwork. And I was still hell-bent on moving to California, which we did when Sarisha was a year and a half old. And when I got to San Francisco, I was looking for a place to do breathwork, but I couldn't find one. So I just opened my own shop because I thought, oh, well, this is how I'll pay the rent, and maybe I can get other people to join in. So for 7 years, I operated a shop in the 1990s, like sharing breathwork with people. And I had moved to San Francisco also to try to get a record deal in California, but that whole life fell apart and breathwork became my living. So to answer how breathwork changed my life, like now, 30 years later, like there's this career, there's this, I don't think of it as a career, but the life I have is other people are doing this breath work. I changed the technique quite a bit, but I still love the breath work. I still love to do it. I love to share it with people. And I have all these people that are out doing this breath work and sharing it with others. So to think about how it changed my life, like I don't know what direction my life would have gone had I not met Pat and met Tom and done the breath on the week that they were leaving to California. But it definitely changed the direction of my life.